The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour as Marcus Chan gripped the steering wheel with hands that hadn't stopped shaking in 3 days. 72 hours. That's all the time he had left before the hearing that would decide whether his daughter lived with him or became a statistic in the foster care system. The accusation was simple: child neglect. The reality was far more complicated. Marcus had been working 3 jobs for the past 8 months. Morning shift at the bakery, afternoon deliveries for a courier service, night stocking at a 24-hour grocery store. 16-hour days, 6 days a week. His 10-year-old daughter, Sophie, had been staying with his elderly neighbor Mrs. Patterson during his shifts, a kind woman who'd known his late wife and had volunteered to help. Then Mrs. Patterson fell. Hip fracture, hospitalization, rehab facility. All within the span of a week. For 3 days, Marcus had no backup childcare. Sophie was responsible for her age, mature beyond her years after losing her mother to cancer 2 years ago. So he'd made a choice that now haunted him. He left her alone for 6 hours while he worked his essential shifts, checking on her every hour by phone, rushing home between jobs. Then his nosy neighbor, the one who'd never liked him, had called Child Protective Services. "Your daughter was seen alone after dark multiple times," the CPS worker had said, her expression sympathetic but firm. "We have to investigate. There's a hearing scheduled. You'll need to prove you can provide adequate supervision." But how could he prove that? He'd already missed 2 days of work dealing with this mess. His boss at the courier service had let him go. "Can't have unreliable drivers, buddy, sorry." The bakery was on thin ice with his attendance. He was drowning in medical debt from his wife's treatment, behind on rent, and now facing the possibility of losing Sophie. The only thing he had left was his integrity, and even that was being questioned. The rain hammered harder. Marcus's eyes burned from exhaustion. He should have taken the highway home, but he'd gone through side streets trying to save gas money. Every dollar mattered when you had $47 in your bank account and $3,000 in debt. That's when he saw it. A silver SUV pulled off on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking desperately through the storm. Someone stood beside it, barely visible through the sheets of rain, frantically waving their arms. Marcus's first instinct was to keep driving. He was exhausted. He was broke. He had his own disasters to deal with. Getting involved in someone else's problem was the last thing he needed. But his wife's voice echoed in his head, as clearly as if she were sitting beside him. "We don't get to choose when to be good people, Marcus. We're either good people or we're not." He pulled over. The woman outside was soaked through, her business suit plastered to her frame, her phone clutched uselessly in her hand. As Marcus's headlights illuminated her, he saw the terror in her eyes, the kind of fear that comes from being stranded and vulnerable. He got out of his car, instantly drenched. "Are you okay?" he called over the sound of the rain. "My car died. I've been here for 40 minutes. No one will stop." Her voice cracked with desperation. "I have an emergency at home. My son, I need to get home." "Pop the hood," Marcus said, already moving toward her vehicle. "Let me take a look." "I don't have any cash to pay you," she said, her words tumbling out. "My wallet is at home. I can give you my information, but I need to get home. Let's just see if I can fix it first," Marcus replied, lifting the hood. The problem revealed itself immediately. A snapped serpentine belt. Common failure in heavy rain. Easy diagnosis. Impossible fix without the right part. "Your belt's gone," Marcus told her. "You're not driving this home tonight." Her face crumpled. "I have to get home. My son has type 1 diabetes. His insulin pump malfunctioned earlier, and I left him with my teenage daughter while I went to get his backup supplies. I've been calling, but no one's answering, and I'm terrified something's wrong." She was on the edge of panic. Marcus understood that feeling. He'd lived in it for 3 days straight. "Where do you live?" he asked. "Riverside Heights. It's about 20 minutes from here." Marcus looked at his ancient Honda Civic. The car that burned oil and had a check engine light that had been on for 6 months. The car he couldn't afford to fix but couldn't afford to replace. "I'll take you," he said. "What? No, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering. Come on." They ran to his car through the rain. Once inside, she turned to him with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm Elena, by the way. Elena Martinez. Marcus Chun. Let's get you home." As they drove through the storm, Elena explained. Her 14-year-old daughter Chloe was responsible, but her son Jamie was only 8, and his diabetes required constant monitoring. The insulin pump failure earlier had been scary enough, but now with no one answering her calls, she was imagining worst-case scenarios. "I'm sure they're fine," Marcus said, trying to sound reassuring while his own anxiety churned. "Phone service gets spotty in storms like this." "You're probably right." Elena took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry. I'm not usually this much of a mess. It's just been a really difficult week." "I understand difficult weeks," Marcus said quietly. When they pulled up to her house, a modest but well-maintained home in a decent neighborhood, lights were on inside. Elena practically fell out of the car before it fully stopped. Running to the door, Marcus watched through the rain-streaked windshield as the door opened. A teenage girl appeared, looking annoyed rather than distressed. Elena disappeared inside. Marcus waited. He didn't know why he waited, but something told him to make sure everything was okay. 5 minutes later, Elena emerged with an umbrella and a checkbook. She ran to his window. "They're fine," she said, her relief palpable. The storm knocked out the phone lines. Chloe was handling everything perfectly. I panicked." She laughed, shaky with emotion. "Thank you. Please, let me pay you for gas and your time." "No need," Marcus said. "I'm just glad your son is okay. At least give me your contact information. I want to send you something to thank you." Marcus hesitated. What would he even give her? His disconnected home phone number? His email that he rarely checked because he barely had time to sleep, let alone manage email? But Elena was persistent, so he scribbled his name and email on a scrap of paper from his glove compartment. She took it carefully, protecting it from the rain. "You're a good man, Marcus Chen," she said. "The world needs more people like you." Marcus drove home thinking about those words. A good man. If only the CPS investigator could see him that way instead of as a negligent parent who left his daughter unsupervised. He pulled into his apartment complex at 1 a.m., exhausted beyond measure. Sophie would be asleep, safe with Mrs. Patterson's niece who'd finally arrived from out of state to help. In 70 hours, he'd stand in front of a judge and fight to keep his daughter. He had no idea that the woman he'd just helped would become the key to everything. The family courtroom was smaller than Marcus had imagined, less imposing but somehow more intimate in its coldness. He sat at a wooden table with his court-appointed attorney, a kind but overworked woman named Sarah Gonzalez who'd been honest about their chances. "The system is overwhelmed," she'd told him during their brief consultation. "Judges err on the side of caution." The fact that Sophie was left alone multiple times, even with reasonable cause, creates a pattern they worry about. Across the aisle sat Jessica Morrison, the CPS caseworker, with her neat stack of files and expressions of professional concern. She wasn't cruel, Marcus could tell. She probably genuinely believed she was protecting children. But she didn't understand that sometimes parents had to make impossible choices between terrible options. Behind Marcus sat Sophie, her hair in the neat braids he'd learned to do from YouTube videos, wearing her best dress, the one they'd bought for her mother's funeral. She was trying to be brave, but he could see the fear in her eyes every time he glanced back. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Elena Martinez." Marcus stood automatically, his exhausted brain taking a moment to process what the bailiff had just said. Elena Martinez. No, couldn't be. But then she entered, black robes flowing, and Marcus's heart stopped. The woman from the rain. The desperate mother he'd driven home through the storm 3 nights ago. She was the judge. She was the judge. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. He saw recognition flash across her face, followed immediately by carefully constructed neutrality. She took her seat behind the bench, her expression now completely professional. "Please be seated," she said, her voice controlled and authoritative. "We're here today for the case of Sophie Chin, matter of supervision and welfare. Let's begin." Marcus's mind reeled. What were the odds? Of all the judges, of all the courtrooms, of all the impossible coincidences. "Mr. Chan," Judge Martinez said, looking directly at him, "I understand you've been facing some challenges lately. Would you like to tell me, in your own words, what happened?" Her tone was neutral, revealing nothing. But something in the way she asked, not accusatory but genuinely curious, made Marcus believe he might actually be heard. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "8 months ago my wife died. Lung cancer. We'd spent everything we had trying to save her. I was left with a daughter to raise and mountains of debt." He felt Sophie shift behind him, and he fought to keep his voice from breaking. "I've been working 3 jobs trying to keep us afloat. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had been watching Sophie during my shifts. She was wonderful, like a grandmother to us. Then she fell and broke her hip. Her niece finally arrived to help, but there was a 3-day gap where I had no childcare." "And during those 3 days?" Judge Martinez asked. "During those 3 days I made a choice I'm not proud of, but it was the only choice I could see. I left Sophie alone for 6-hour stretches while I worked. I called every hour. I rushed home between jobs. Sophie is mature for her age, responsible. But I knew it wasn't ideal. I knew I was taking a risk." "Mr. Chun, why didn't you call in sick to work?" Marcus met her eyes. "Because I've already been on thin ice for attendance, Your Honor. My wife's illness meant a lot of missed days. I was terrified of losing another income stream. We were already behind on rent. I had to make the impossible choice between financial survival and the risk of leaving Sophie briefly unsupervised." Jessica Morrison stood. "Your Honor, while we sympathize with Mr. Chen's situation, the fact remains that he left a 10-year-old child alone multiple times. What if there had been an emergency? What if something had happened?" "But nothing did happen," Sarah Gonzalez interjected, "because Mr. Chun was responsible about it. He called constantly. He worked close to home. He made sure Sophie had everything she needed." Judge Martinez held up a hand. "I'd like to hear from Sophie, if that's acceptable." Marcus nodded, his heart in his throat. Sophie stood, small and brave, and approached the bench. "Hi, Sophie," Judge Martinez said gently. "How are you doing today?" "I'm scared," Sophie admitted, her voice quiet but clear. "I don't want to leave my dad." "I understand. Can you tell me what happened during those days when you were home alone?" Sophie took a breath. "Dad called me every hour. He made sure I had food and my homework and everything I needed. I read my book and did my math problems. When I got scared of the thunder one night, I called him and he stayed on the phone with me until it passed." "Were you afraid when you were alone?" "Sometimes. But I was more afraid when Mom was sick and we didn't know if she'd be okay. And I was afraid when Dad cried because he couldn't pay for her medicine. Being alone for a few hours wasn't the scary part, Your Honor. The scary part is thinking I might have to leave my dad when he's the only parent I have left." Judge Martinez's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Thank you, Sophie. You can sit down now." After Sophie returned to her seat, Judge Martinez reviewed the documents before her. The courtroom was silent except for the rustle of papers. Finally, she spoke. "I've read the CPS report. I've heard the testimonies. And I'm going to be frank with this court about something that rarely gets acknowledged in these proceedings." She looked up, her eyes sweeping across the room. "Our system is designed to protect children, which is absolutely as it should be. But sometimes, In our zeal to protect, we fail to see the difference between neglect born of indifference and decisions born of impossible circumstances. Marcus felt hope kindle in his chest, dangerous and bright. "Mr. Chan," Judge Martinez continued, "your choices during those 3 days were not ideal. In a perfect world, you would have had backup childcare, financial security, and time to properly arrange for Sophie's supervision. But this isn't a perfect world. This is a world where a widowed father works himself to exhaustion trying to keep his daughter housed and fed. A world where one medical crisis can financially destroy a family. A world where sometimes there are no good options, only less bad ones." She paused, looking directly at Marcus. "3 nights ago, I was stranded in a storm, desperate to get home to my son who has a serious medical condition. I was terrified, vulnerable, and a stranger stopped to help me. He didn't ask for payment. He didn't ask questions. He just helped, even though he clearly had his own burdens to carry." Marcus felt his eyes widen. She was acknowledging it. She was actually acknowledging what had happened. "That stranger showed me that character isn't about perfection. It's about choices. And the choice to help someone in need, even when you're struggling yourself, tells me more about a person's parenting capacity than a 3-day gap in childcare ever could." Jessica Morrison stood abruptly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, are you saying you know Mr. Chun personally?" "I'm saying I encountered Mr. Chan in an emergency situation where I was able to observe his character," Judge Martinez replied calmly. "And I'm using all available information, including that observation, to make my determination in this case." She looked at the CPS worker directly. "Ms. Morrison, I'm not dismissing your concerns. You're right that children need proper supervision. But I'm also not going to destroy a family over 3 days of less than ideal circumstances when there's clear evidence that the father loves his child and is trying his absolute best in an impossible situation." Judge Martinez turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Chun, I'm going to order ongoing check-ins with CPS for the next 6 months. I'm also going to require that you establish a permanent backup childcare plan and provide proof of that plan within 30 days. Can you do that?" "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "Good. Then I'm ruling that Sophie remains in your custody. Case closed." The gavel came down, and Marcus felt his legs give out. He sank into his chair, hands shaking, tears streaming down his face. Behind him, Sophie was crying too, but they were tears of relief. Sarah Gonzalez was patting his shoulder, saying something about how unusual and lucky this outcome was. But Marcus barely heard her. His eyes were on Judge Martinez as she gathered her papers and prepared to leave the bench. She met his gaze one more time before she exited. The smallest nod, an acknowledgement of what they both knew, that sometimes justice requires seeing beyond the black and white of rules to the complicated gray of human reality. And sometimes kindness in a storm comes back to you in ways you never could have imagined. The coffee shop near the courthouse was busy with the lunch crowd, but Marcus hardly noticed the noise. He sat at a corner table, Sophie beside him working on homework, waiting. It had been Sophie's idea, actually. "Dad, you should thank her properly," she'd said last week. "You know, the judge, the one who kept us together. You should get her a thank you card or something." "I don't think judges accept gifts from people whose cases they decided," Marcus had replied. "Not a gift, just a thank you. Like how Mrs. Patterson always said you should acknowledge kindness." Mrs. Patterson was home now, recovering well, and had resumed her role as Sophie's primary childcare during Marcus's work hours. Marcus had also managed to get a better single job, assistant manager at a hardware store with decent benefits and regular hours. The financial pressure hadn't disappeared, but it had eased enough that he could breathe. The CPS check-ins had gone smoothly. 6 months had passed. The case was officially closed. So when Marcus had seen Judge Martinez's name in the coffee shop that morning, she was apparently a regular. According to the barista, he'd left a note with the cashier. Just a simple message. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Marcus Chun. He hadn't expected a response. But an hour later, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. Coffee shop? 1 p.m.? Elena Martinez. Now they sat waiting, Sophie fidgeting with nervous excitement. What if she doesn't come? Sophie whispered. Then we tried, kiddo. That's what matters. But at 1:02, Elena Martinez walked through the door. She wasn't in judicial robes this time, just jeans and a casual blazer, looking more like the terrified mother from the storm than the authoritative judge from the courtroom. She spotted them immediately and smiled, walking over. Hi, she said, slightly awkward. I don't usually do this, meet with people from cases I've decided. It's probably breaking about 15 informal rules. We can leave if this is inappropriate, Marcus said quickly. No, please. Sit. I wanted to talk to you. Off the record. Person to person. Not judge to defendant. They sat. Sophie stared at her with wide eyes. You saved my dad, Sophie said suddenly. The lady at CPS said we were probably going to be separated. But you saved him. Elena's expression softened. Your dad saved himself, Sophie. He showed me who he really was that night in the storm. I just made sure the court saw what I'd seen. Was that allowed? Marcus asked. Using that as part of your decision? Elena took a breath. Honestly, it was a gray area. Some judges would say no, that any personal interaction should have meant immediate recusal. Others would say that character evidence is always relevant, no matter how it's obtained. I chose to believe the latter. She looked directly at Marcus. I took a risk with your case. I bent some rules because I believed it was the right thing to do. And I need to know, did I make the right choice? Sophie's happy, Marcus said simply. She's doing well in school. We have stable housing, stable childcare, stable income. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying. That's all any parent can do, Elena replied. Try. Love their children. Make the best choices they can with the information and resources they have. Your son, Marcus asked. Jamie? How is he? Elena smiled. He's good. The pump issues were sorted out. He's thriving. And Chloe, my daughter, she's decided she wants to study social work in college. She says she wants to help families like yours. Families that need support, not separation. They talked for an hour. About parenting, about justice, about the impossible weight of making life-altering decisions with incomplete information. Elena shared how that night in the storm had changed her perspective on her work, made her question assumptions she hadn't even known she was making. I see so many cases, she admitted, and it's easy to become desensitized to see patterns instead of people. But that night, standing in the rain, terrified for my son, I was just a parent, desperate, imperfect, doing my best. And you helped me anyway. Anyone would have, Marcus said. No. Elena shook her head firmly. Many people drove past me that night. You were the one who stopped. And you had every reason not to. You were dealing with your own crisis. But you stopped anyway. As they prepared to leave, Elena turned to Sophie. Can I give you some advice? Sophie nodded eagerly. Your dad is a good man. Not perfect. None of us are. But good. Real. Don't ever let anyone make you doubt that. And when you grow up, be like him. Be the person who stops in the storm. 6 months later, Marcus received an unexpected letter. It was from Elena Martinez, but it wasn't about the case. It was an invitation. Dear Marcus and Sophie, I'm writing to invite you to an event I'm hosting next month. It's a community forum on family law reform, specifically focused on how the system can better support struggling families rather than automatically moving to separate them. I'd like you to speak, if you're willing, to share your story, because I think people need to hear it, judges, lawyers, social workers, policymakers. They need to understand that sometimes the parents who look the worst on paper are actually the heroes we're not seeing. You don't have to decide right now. Think about it. but I hope you'll consider it. With respect and gratitude, Elena. Marcus thought about it for exactly 1 day before saying yes. If stories like this still mean something to you, don't just scroll. Subscribe and stay for the next one. The community center was packed the night of the forum. Marcus had expected maybe 50 people. There were over 200. Judges, CPS workers, family lawyers, advocates, parents who'd been through the system, all gathered to discuss how things could be better. Elena Martinez stood at the podium, opening the event with words that resonated through the room. "We have a system that's designed to protect children," she said. "And that's good. That's necessary. But we also have a system that sometimes can't see the difference between a bad parent and a struggling parent, between neglect and poverty, between abuse and exhaustion." She gestured to Marcus, sitting in the front row with Sophie beside him. "I'd like to introduce you to someone who taught me to see that difference. Marcus Chin, would you come up here?" Marcus's hands shook as he walked to the podium. Public speaking wasn't exactly his forte. But Sophie gave him an encouraging thumbs up, and he took a breath. "I almost lost my daughter," he began. "Not because I didn't love her, not because I didn't try, but because I was poor, exhausted, and out of options after my wife died." He told the story, all of it. The debt, the jobs, Mrs. Patterson's fall, the impossible choice. He talked about the terror of that hearing, the certainty that he'd lose Sophie, the miracle of Judge Martinez's decision. "I was one of the lucky ones," he said. "I got a judge who saw me as a person, not a case file. But how many parents aren't lucky? How many families are destroyed not because of abuse, but because of circumstances?" He looked out at the crowd. "I'm not saying there shouldn't be oversight. Children need protection. But they also need their parents, even if those parents are struggling. Maybe especially if those parents are struggling." When he finished, the applause was thunderous. But more importantly, hands shot up with questions. Real questions. Thoughtful questions. Questions that suggested people were actually listening. Over the next hour, the conversation expanded. A CPS worker admitted that she'd been too quick to judge in some cases, that she'd made recommendations based on assumptions rather than investigation. A family court judge confessed that he'd never considered how his rulings might be influenced by his own privilege. Parents shared their stories of barely avoiding separation, of living in constant fear that one mistake would cost them everything. Sophie raised her hand. Elena called on her immediately. "I just want to say," Sophie's voice was small but clear, "that if they'd taken me from my dad, it would have broken both of us. Not because foster care is bad, but because we're a family. We belong together. And just because we don't have a lot of money doesn't mean we don't have a lot of love." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. After the forum ended, people crowded around Marcus. Former CPS clients thanking him for speaking up. Lawyers asking if they could reference his case in their advocacy work. Parents just wanting to shake his hand, to feel less alone in their struggles. Elena found him in the crowd, pulled him aside. "You changed minds tonight," she said. "I could see it. This is going to matter." "I just told the truth," Marcus replied. "That's exactly what we needed." As they walked out into the parking lot, Sophie between them, Elena said something that would stay with Marcus forever. "You know what I've learned? Justice isn't just about following rules. It's about seeing people, really seeing them. And that night in the storm, you saw me, not as a judge, not as someone important, just as a person who needed help. And somehow that led to this, all of this." She gestured back at the community center, where people were still gathered in small groups, still talking, still thinking about what could be better. "One act of kindness," she continued. "One choice to stop and look at the ripples." 3 years later, Marcus stood in a different courtroom. But this time, he wasn't the defendant. He was a witness for a family law reform bill that Elena had helped draft, legislation that required family courts to consider financial hardship and lack of resources as mitigating factors in supervision cases, that mandated support services before separation, that recognized the difference between poverty and neglect. Sophie, now 13, sat in the gallery with Mrs. Patterson, watching as her father testified before state legislators about how close they'd come to being torn apart. The bill passed. It wasn't perfect, no law ever is, but it was better. It would help families like Marcus's, give judges like Elena more tools to keep families together while addressing safety concerns. After the vote, as Marcus descended the courthouse steps, a reporter called out to him, "Mr. Chan, how does it feel to know your story helped change the law?" Marcus thought about that question, about the rainy night 3 years ago when he'd almost kept driving, about the choice to stop, about Elena Martinez standing terrified in the storm, and then powerful behind the bench, and now working tirelessly to fix a broken system. "It doesn't feel like my story," he finally answered. "It feels like our story. Mine, Judge Martinez's, Sophie's, and every family that's been torn apart by circumstances rather than choice. This law is for all of them." "What advice would you give to parents who are struggling right now?" Marcus looked at Sophie, who smiled at him with pride so fierce it made his chest ache. "I'd say this: keep fighting. Love your children. Do your best. And if you can, when you see someone else struggling, even when you're struggling yourself, help them. Because kindness isn't a luxury. It's not something you do when you have extra time or money or energy. It's who you choose to be in the hardest moments." That night, at home in their small but comfortable apartment, the one they could now afford thanks to Marcus's promotion at the hardware store, Sophie asked him a question while they made dinner together. "Dad, do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd kept driving that night? If you hadn't helped Judge Martinez?" Marcus paused, knife hovering over the vegetables he was chopping. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I remember what your mom used to say." "What?" "That we don't get to choose when to be good people. We're either good people or we're not." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "So you didn't stop because you thought you'd get something out of it. You stopped because that's who you are." "I stopped because it was the right thing to do. Everything that came after, that was just the universe making sure kindness didn't go unrewarded." "I'm glad you stopped." "Me too, kiddo. Me too." 5 years after that rainy night, Elena Martinez was promoted to the state appeals court. Her first major ruling, upholding the family law reform legislation that Marcus had helped inspire, setting a precedent that would influence family court decisions across multiple states. Marcus framed the news article about her appointment and hung it in his office at the hardware store, where he'd been promoted to general manager. Beneath it, he placed a small plaque that read, "Character is who you are in the storm." Sophie, now 15 and volunteering with a youth advocacy group for children in the foster care system, understood the meaning better than most. She knew her father had almost lost her because the system couldn't see his love through his poverty. She knew Elena Martinez had risked her career to make sure that didn't happen. And she knew that one choice, one moment of kindness in a storm, had changed not just their lives, but potentially thousands of lives. Sometimes the universe doesn't just reward kindness. It multiplies it. And sometimes, the person you help in their darkest moment becomes the person who sees you through yours. Marcus Chun stopped in the rain. Elena Martinez looked beyond the rules to see the truth. Together, they proved that justice isn't blind. It just needs to open its eyes wide enough to see what really matters. The rest is just ripples, spreading outward, touching shores they'll never see, changing tides they'll never know about. But that's how real change works. One choice, one person, one storm at a time.